The first thing anyone noticed about Samuel Vickers when he walked into the Coast Guard station at Port Angeles on the morning of November 12, 1903, was that he was alone. The second thing they noticed was that he wouldn't say why. The station master, a man named Carlyle, who'd seen 20 years of marine disasters and had learned to read survival in a man's eyes, later told investigators that Vickers looked present but not present. He was coherent. He answered direct questions about his name, his point of departure, his vessel. But when asked about the other 4 men who'd left with him 9 days earlier, Vickers simply looked at Carlyle and said, "They didn't make it back." "How?" Carlyle asked. Vickers set his hands flat on the desk between them. His fingernails, Carlyle noted in his report, were torn down to the quick. "I'd like to send a wire to my wife," he said. That was all he would say. The refusal wasn't dramatic. There was no breakdown, no visible anguish. In the days that followed, when pressed by the marshal, by the families of the missing men, by journalists who'd gotten wind of the story, Vickers maintained the same strange composure. He would confirm facts, dates, locations, weather conditions, but the moment any question turned toward what happened, his face would go still and he would say very quietly, "I can't speak to that." Not won't, can't. His wife, Martha, told a reporter from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer that Samuel hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to her in the first week after his return. He ate what she put in front of him. He slept, though poorly she could hear him walking the house at night, and he worked his small plot of land with the same methodical care he'd always shown. But he didn't meet her eyes. And when she asked just once what had happened to the Hendricks brothers, to Tom Ashford, to young William Petrie, Samuel had simply shaken his head and walked out to the barn. She never asked again. The official inquest, convened in late November of 1903, lasted 3 days. Vickers attended every session. He sat in the front row, hands folded in his lap, and answered every question put to him with the same maddening precision. Yes, they had departed Nia Bay on November 3rd. Yes, the weather had turned. Yes, they had made landfall on Tatoosh Island. Yes, they had taken shelter in the lighthouse keeper's cottage. And then, when the questions narrowed, "What happened in the cottage, Mr. Vickers? Where are the other men, Mr. Vickers?" He would pause as if genuinely considering how to answer and then say, "I can't tell you that." The coroner, frustrated, asked if he meant he didn't remember. "No, sir," Vickers said. "I remember." "Then why won't you tell us?" Vickers looked at him for a long moment. "Because it wouldn't help anyone. The inquest ruled the deaths accidental, cause unknown. No bodies were ever recovered. What remains, more than a century later, is the image of Samuel Vickers walking into that Coast Guard station, soaked to the bone, eyes clear, mouth shut. And the question that every historian who's touched this case has asked, what did he see that he believed silence was the greater mercy? In the autumn of 1903, Samuel Vickers was 32 years old, married 4 years, and known throughout Clallam County as a man of steady temperament and few words. He worked as a timber surveyor, which meant he spent long stretches in the peninsula's forests, mapping old growth for the mills. It was solitary work, and it suited him, but he wasn't a hermit. Those who knew him, neighbors, fellow congregants at the Methodist Church in Port Angeles, the men he occasionally drank with at Morrison's Tavern, described him as reliable, even-keeled, and possessed of what one man called a decent sense of when to keep his thoughts to himself. He had no debts, no enemies, and no history of erratic behavior. Martha Vickers, née Hollis, was 28, the daughter of a failed prospector who died of pneumonia the winter before her wedding. She ran a small business out of their home, mending clothes and doing alterations for the wives of mill workers. In a letter to her cousin in Spokane, written 2 weeks before Samuel's departure, she described their marriage as quiet but not unhappy. They had no children yet, though she hoped that would change. Samuel's companions on the November voyage were men he'd known in varying degrees for years. The Hendricks brothers, Jacob, 39, and Carl, 36, were commercial fishermen who ran a small operation out of Nia Bay. They were Swedes, immigrants who'd arrived in Washington Territory in the late 1880s and worked their way from dock hands to boat owners. They were known as hard workers, quick to laugh and fiercely loyal to one another. Jacob had a wife and 3 children. Carl was unmarried, though there were rumors he supported a woman in Port Townsend. Tom Ashford, 41, was a lighthouse keeper who'd spent the better part of 2 decades on the coast. He'd worked Tatoosh Island, Destruction Island, Cape Flattery. He knew the waters better than anyone in the region, and he knew the weather. If Tom Ashford told you not to go out, you didn't go out. He was a drinker, but a functional one. His wife had left him in 1898, and he hadn't remarried. William Petrie was 19 years old. He was the son of a Port Angeles schoolteacher, a boy who'd grown up on stories of the sea and wanted nothing more than to work the water. He'd apprenticed with the Hendricks brothers that summer, learning to mend nets and read the current. Jacob Hendricks later said, before he disappeared, that William had the makings of a real sailor if he could learn to keep his head in rough water. He was eager. He talked too much. He was young. These 5 men came together, not by accident, but by circumstance. In early November, the lighthouse at Tatoosh Island, a low, rocky outcrop at the northwestern tip of the Olympic Peninsula, lost contact with the mainland. The keeper, a man named Guthrie, had missed 2 scheduled signal checks. The Coast Guard was short-handed, and a storm was brewing. Tom Ashford, who knew Guthrie personally and had worked Tatoosh before, volunteered to make the crossing and check on him. Jacob Hendricks offered his boat. Carl came along because he always did. Samuel Vickers, who had surveying work near Nia Bay and knew Tom casually, was invited to join them. William Petrie begged to come, and Jacob, against his better judgment, said yes. None of them had any reason to think they wouldn't be back in 2 days. The last person to see all 5 men together on the mainland was a dock worker named Horace Lim, who helped them load supplies onto the Hendricks boat on the morning of November 3rd. He later told investigators that the mood was light. Carl Hendricks was teasing William about seasickness. Tom Ashford was double-checking the weather glass. Samuel Vickers was coiling rope, methodical and silent as always. Lim said Samuel had nodded to him as they pushed off. Just a nod, nothing more. That was the last confirmed sighting of the group as a whole. What we know of their relationships comes from letters, from family interviews conducted in the months after the disappearance, from the small, mundane records people leave behind. Jacob Hendricks wrote to his wife every time he left port, short notes of affection and instruction. Carl kept a logbook, though it was never recovered. Tom Ashford had a reputation for telling stories in taverns, tales of storms and wrecks, and the strange things men saw when they were alone on the water too long. William Petrie kept a journal his mother later found, full of sketches of boats and breathless descriptions of the horizon. Samuel Vickers left almost nothing. There are no letters from him in any archive, no journal, no recorded interviews from before the event. What we know of him comes second-hand, from Martha, from his neighbors, from the few men who worked with him in the forests. One of those men, a sawyer named Halloran, was interviewed in 1954 as part of a local history project. He was asked if he remembered Samuel Vickers. "Sure," Halloran said. "Quiet fellow, good at his job. You could work beside him all day and he wouldn't say more than a dozen words, but they'd be the right ones." The interviewer asked if Vickers had ever talked about the incident. Halloran laughed. Sam didn't talk about anything, but the interviewer pressed. Had Vickers seemed different after he came back? Halloran was quiet for a long time. Then he said, he seemed like a man who'd made a decision. The crossing from Nia Bay to Tatoosh Island is roughly 4 miles. In good weather, it's a short trip. In November, with the swells running high and the wind coming off the Pacific, it can be treacherous. The Hendricks boat was a 30-foot fishing vessel, sturdy but not built for heavy seas. Tom Ashford later, before he disappeared, told a man at the Nia Bay dock that he'd advised against leaving that morning. The barometer was dropping. But Jacob Hendricks had a contract to fulfill, and Guthrie, the lighthouse keeper, was still missing his signal checks. They went. We know they made it to Tatoosh Island because Samuel Vickers confirmed it during the inquest. We know they landed on the lee side of the island, in a small cove the keepers used for supplies. We know they climbed the rocky path to the lighthouse and found the cottage attached to it. What happened next is where the record fractures. Vickers confirmed that they found evidence Guthrie had been there recently, food still in the cupboard, a fire recently banked, but Guthrie himself was gone. No sign of struggle, no note. Just an empty cottage and a lighthouse that was still burning, its lamp tended, its mechanism turning. Vickers confirmed that the weather worsened, that they decided to wait out the storm in the cottage, rather than risk the crossing back. He confirmed that they stayed there for 3 days. But when asked what happened during those 3 days, what they talked about, what they did, how the other men died, Vickers would only say, "It became clear we couldn't all leave." The phrase appeared in multiple testimonies, always worded the same way, as if he'd rehearsed it, as if it was the only formulation that felt true. A marshal named Decker, frustrated, asked him to clarify. "Do you mean the boat was damaged?" "No, sir." "Then what do you mean?" Vickers paused. "I mean it became clear." The last confirmed moment the 5 men were together, alive, intact, a group, is impossible to pinpoint. Vickers wouldn't give it, but we can reconstruct the outline. On the evening of November 5th, 2 days into their stay, a supply ship passing Tatoosh Island reported seeing lamplight in the cottage windows. The ship's log noted multiple figures visible. And the ship didn't stop. Tatoosh wasn't on their route, but the entry confirms that as of that evening, more than one person was alive in that cottage. On the morning of November 6th, a fisherman working the waters off Cape Flattery reported hearing what he thought were gunshots coming from the direction of Tatoosh. He didn't investigate. Gunshots weren't uncommon. Keepers sometimes fired signal flares or shot at seals raiding their supplies. On November 7th, the weather broke, and on the morning of November 8th, Samuel Vickers appeared alone in a small dinghy off the coast near Seku, 15 miles east of Tatoosh. A Marca fisherman named Peter Ward spotted him and towed him in. Ward later said Vickers was rowing steadily, not frantically. He looked exhausted, but he wasn't injured. He wasn't bleeding. He wasn't hysterical. Ward asked him where he'd come from. Vickers said, "Tatoosh." Ward asked where the others were. Vickers said, "Gone." Ward, unsettled, asked if Vickers needed help. Vickers said, "I need to get to Port Angeles." Ward towed him to Nia Bay, where Vickers was given dry clothes and a meal. The station chief there, a man named Polk, tried to question him. Vickers wouldn't answer. He asked to be taken to Port Angeles. Polk, sensing something was badly wrong, agreed. That's the separation. Somewhere between the evening of November 5th and the morning of November 8th, 4 men ceased to exist, and 1 man began a silence that would last the rest of his life. The Coast Guard sent a crew to Tatoosh Island on November 10th. They found the cottage in order. Beds made, dishes washed, the lighthouse lamp still burning. They found no bodies. They found no blood. They found, in the logbook kept by the lighthouse service, a single entry in handwriting that didn't match Guthrie's or any of the missing men. It was dated November 6th. It read, "Weather clearing. Lamp functional. Departure imminent." The handwriting was later matched to Samuel Vickers. No other evidence was ever recovered from the island. No clothing, no weapons, no sign of struggle or flight. The dinghy Vickers had used was traced back to the lighthouse's emergency supplies, 1 of 2 kept on the island. The other dinghy was still there, undamaged. The Hendricks boat was found 3 weeks later, adrift and waterlogged, 30 miles south of Tatoosh. It was empty. There was no damage to the hull. The oars were still lashed in place. At the inquest, the prosecuting attorney asked Vickers point blank, "Did you kill those men?" Vickers looked at him. "No, sir." "Then what happened to them?" Vickers didn't answer. The attorney, furious, demanded the coroner hold him in contempt. The coroner, a pragmatic man named Feist, declined. "He's answered the question I care about," Feist said. "He says he didn't kill them. I believe him." Later, outside the courthouse, a journalist asked Feist why he believed Vickers. Feist said, "Because if he'd killed them, he'd have a story. Men who lie tell you everything. Men who are silent are protecting something worse than guilt. The families didn't let it rest. Jacob Hendrick's widow, a woman named Ingrid, hired a lawyer. She wanted Vickers charged with negligence, with abandonment, with something. The lawyer reviewed the inquest records and quietly advised her to let it go. There was no evidence, no witnesses, no body, no crime. Ingrid Hendricks didn't let it go. She went to Port Angeles herself in January of 1904 and knocked on Samuel and Martha Vickers' door. Martha answered. Ingrid demanded to see Samuel. Martha, according to a neighbor who watched from across the street, stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind her. The two women spoke for less than a minute. Then Ingrid Hendricks left, and she never came back. Years later, Ingrid's daughter, one of Jacob's children, was interviewed by a student researcher working on a thesis about maritime disasters. The daughter, by then in her 50s, was asked if her mother ever found out what happened to her father. No, the daughter said, but Mrs. Vickers told her something. What? She wouldn't say. But after that, Mama stopped asking. Carl Hendricks had no wife, no children. His estate, such as it was, went to a cousin in Minnesota who never inquired further. Tom Ashford's estranged wife, living in Portland, was notified of his presumed death. She submitted a claim for his pension and moved on. She remarried 2 years later. William Petrie's mother, a schoolteacher named Ruth, was destroyed by the loss. She wrote letters to the governor, to the Coast Guard, to the Department of the Interior, demanding an investigation. She got form letters in response. She wrote to Samuel Vickers directly. He never replied. In 1906, Ruth Petrie published a short piece in the Port Angeles Tribune, an open letter to the man who returned. It's a raw, anguished thing, full of grief and anger. She accused Vickers of cowardice. She accused him of lying. She begged him in writing to tell her how her son had died. Even if it was terrible, she wrote, I am his mother. I deserve to know. Vickers never responded publicly. But Martha Vickers later told a neighbor that Samuel had read the letter once and then burned it in the stove. He didn't speak for 2 days afterward. Ruth Petrie died in 1911. She never got her answer. The pressure on Vickers wasn't just external. In the months following his return, he was watched. The marshal's office kept tabs on him. Journalists showed up at his door. Neighbors whispered. A few of the men at Morrison's Tavern refused to drink with him. One man, a logger named Trent, confronted him outside the church one Sunday and called him a coward to his face. Vickers didn't respond. He just walked past. Martha later told her cousin that the silence was harder on her than it was on Samuel. He's made his peace with it, she wrote in a letter dated March 1904. But I live with a man who's carrying something he won't set down, and I don't know if it's shame or fear or something else entirely. Oh, she asked him once if he regretted coming back. He said, no. She asked if he wished he'd died with the others. He said, no. She asked if he'd done something unforgivable. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, I did what I had to. And that, Martha said, was the only explanation he ever gave. By 1905, the attention had faded. The families had moved on or given up. The journalists found other stories. The marshal closed the file. Samuel Vickers went back to work, surveying timber in the peninsula's forests, coming home to Martha, living a life that looked from the outside unremarkable. But there were changes. He stopped going to church. He stopped drinking at Morrison's. He sold their house in Port Angeles in 1907 and moved Martha to a smaller property outside Sequim, farther from town, farther from people. He took contracts that kept him in the woods for weeks at a time. And he began, according to the few people who still knew him, to show signs of what we might now call hypervigilance. A man who bought timber from Vickers in 1909 later recalled that Samuel wouldn't meet in enclosed spaces. He insisted on conducting business outdoors, even in the rain. He didn't like being inside with the door closed, the man said. I asked him why once, and he just said he preferred the air. Another acquaintance, a surveyor who worked alongside Vickers in 1912, said, Samuel had a habit of counting the people in a room. We'd be in a logging camp, 10 or 12 men around a fire, and Sam would look around, counting heads. Every time someone left or came back, he'd count again, like he was making sure. Of what? He never said. Martha Vickers stayed with him. They never had children. In a letter to her cousin in 1918, she wrote, "Samuel is a good man, and I love him, but I sometimes wonder if I'm married to a whole person or just the part of one that came back." She didn't elaborate. In 1923, a reporter from a Seattle magazine, working on a retrospective piece about unsolved maritime mysteries, tracked down Samuel Vickers. He was 52 by then, graying, still working. The reporter asked if he'd be willing to speak, even off the record. Vickers said, "No, sir." The reporter pressed, said it had been 20 years, said people had a right to know. Vickers looked at him and said, "People have a right to a lot of things. Doesn't mean giving it to them is the right thing to do." The reporter asked what he meant. Vickers said, "Some things, once you say them, they don't go away. They live in the person who hears them. I won't do that." The reporter left empty-handed. That quote, "Some things, once you say them, they don't go away," is the closest Samuel Vickers ever came to explaining himself. Samuel Vickers died on February 3, 1931, at the age of 60. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. He was buried in the Sequim Valley Cemetery, a small plot with a simple headstone. Martha was there, a handful of neighbors, no one from Nia Bay, no one from the families of the men who'd disappeared. The funeral was brief. The pastor, a young man who hadn't known Samuel well, gave a generic eulogy about faith and rest. Martha didn't speak. Afterward, she went home, and as far as the record shows, she never spoke publicly about her husband again. She lived another 12 years. She died in 1943 and was buried beside him. Her estate was minimal, some land, a few possessions. In her papers archived at the Clallam County Historical Society, there's a single envelope marked Samuel's Effects. Inside is a pocket watch, a surveying compass, and a folded piece of paper. The paper is a list, written in Samuel's hand. 5 names: Jacob Hendricks, Carl Hendricks, Tom Ashford, William Petrie, Samuel Vickers. The last name, his own, is crossed out. There's no date, no explanation, just the list and the single line struck through. It's the only direct evidence we have of how Samuel Vickers thought about what happened on Tatoosh Island. And even then, it tells us nothing. Or maybe it tells us everything and we just can't read it. Over the years, theories have accumulated like barnacles, that the men killed each other in a dispute, over food, over fear, over something we can't imagine. That Vickers killed them in self-defense and couldn't bear to admit it. That they died of exposure or accident, and Vickers, racked with survivor's guilt, simply couldn't find the words. That something happened on that island that was so outside the normal course of human experience that Vickers believed silence was the only rational response. But theories are just stories we tell to fill the gaps. And Samuel Vickers refused to fill the gap. What we're left with is the shape of his refusal. We have his testimony at the inquest, precise and uninformative. We have the accounts of those who knew him, a composite sketch of a man who seemed normal but wasn't, quite. We have Martha's letters, edged with loneliness and confusion. We have the list with his name crossed out. And we have the pattern of his life after 1903, the withdrawal, the hypervigilance, the insistence on space and air and distance. A man arranging his world so that whatever he was carrying wouldn't touch anyone else. The historian's job is to reconstruct, to take fragments and build a narrative that makes sense. But some fragments resist assembly. Some silences aren't gaps to be filled, they're walls, built intentionally to keep something in or keep something out. In 1959, a graduate student at the University of Washington wrote a thesis on maritime disappearances in the Pacific Northwest. She included a chapter on Tatoosh Island. In her conclusion, she wrote, "Vickers' refusal to speak suggests not guilt, but protection. The question is whether he was protecting himself or the people who wanted answers. It's a compelling idea, that there are some truths so heavy that sharing them is an act of violence. That Vickers looked at what he knew and decided the world was better off not knowing. But it's also possible he was protecting the dead. In the few recorded instances where Vickers came close to speaking, he framed his silence as a kind of obligation. It wouldn't help anyone. Some things don't go away. I did what I had to. Not I survived. Not I escaped. I did what I had to. As if survival wasn't a stroke of luck or an act of cowardice, but a role, a task, something he'd been assigned or had taken on and was bound to see through. The most unsettling possibility is that Samuel Vickers believed he'd made a promise, not to the living who wanted answers, but to the men who didn't come back. That somewhere in those 3 days on Tatoosh Island, in circumstances we can't reconstruct, an agreement was made, and part of that agreement was silence. We'll never know. The last person who could have told us died in 1931, and he spent 28 years refusing. What we're left with is the image of a man walking into a Coast Guard station, soaked and alone, and choosing, actively, deliberately, not to speak, and then living with that choice until his heart stopped. There's no resolution here, no closure. Just the recognition that some questions don't have answers because someone decided, for reasons we can only guess at, that the answer was too dangerous to give. Samuel Vickers escaped Tatoosh Island, but he brought something back with him. Not guilt, not trauma, not even a secret exactly. He brought back a silence, and he carried it for the rest of his life. And when he died, he took it with him. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point.